Big picture today. This Labor government is already spending a record amount, but it is insanely desperate for more of your money. Worse, it seems to think it's their money. Now, the first step today, the Prime Minister said, is going to remove tax concessions on super balances of over $3 million.
And today I'm announcing that earnings on super balances above $3 million will have a concessional rate of 30% rather than 15%. This proposal does not change the fundamentals of our superannuation system. 99.5% of people with superannuation are unaffected by this reform.
And that's going to earn the government another $2 billion a year, which is the main point. But it's hard to say this is disgraceful, another broken promise like the opposition is saying. Because, all right, yes, Albanese did say before the election, no changes to super. But these changes don't apply until after the next election. So if you don't want them, then you don't vote Labor next time. No, for me, the bigger picture is the big worry. This government can't stop spending and it keeps needing more money. Today, it also released the annual tax expenditure statement with an expanded list of the things it reckons are really government gifts to the taxpayers. Taxes that the government, out of the goodness of its heart, hasn't yet decided to hit you with, as if your money rightfully is theirs. Here's some of the list, just to give you a flavour. Well, but not taxing your super full whack. It says that's costing us $51 billion. You can see them eyeing off the rest of that. But it went on. If the government is letting you off capital gains tax in your family home, that's costing it $26 billion, as if that money of your home is rightly the government's. And it's not charging the GST for your education or your food. That's billions more that this government has generously given up. So be very careful with that attitude. Who do you think is next for a fresh new tax? Joining me is Sky News business editor, Ross Greenwood. Ross Greenwood, thank you so much for joining me. The changes today, the super changes, necessary?
Look, you could argue they are necessary, but there are other areas that perhaps were politically more difficult that the government could have gone to. With, of course, as you've pointed out, those measures that the government has identified where tax credits are handed out, you know, the tax-free status of the family home, negative gearing, a range of these areas. These were also areas that clearly delivered more benefit in terms of what the public gets from the tax-free status that the government hands out. But you sense that this was politically the low-hanging fruit. They could simply get there and say, look, it's only 0.5% of people, which I've worked out to being around 116,000 people are affected by this when you look at the total number of superannuation funds in Australia. And the second part about it is, does it really collect a lot of tax? $2 billion in the whole scheme of things. But I think from my point of view, this is really yet another example of class warfare, very much at its best, and really the government trying to limit the taxation benefits of superannuation to those people perhaps with not those huge account balances.
Yes, with the stage 3 tax cuts, long promised, long legislated, they're next to go, I should imagine, unless there's a recession when they need the stimulus. But are these super changes fair? You say it's class war, but are they fair?
That's the point about this. There are all sorts of anomalies about superannuation where you raise questions. And so in many ways, what they've done today with this $3 million limit before you go into a 30% tax threshold, that's where the question is. Let's say, for example, you've got a couple, one person has $4 or $5 million in super, the other person has very little. So the person will pay that 30% tax. Take a separate family. They each have $2.9 million in superannuation. They won't pay the tax. They've got combined $5.9 million in superannuation. Is that fair? Take, for example, a person who's put very little into super, but actually has a home that's worth a lot of money. Now, is it fair that that person, quite clearly, is not going to pay the extra tax, the superannuation tax, in fact, will probably collect an age pension from the government, whereas a person who has no home but has more than $3 million in super because they've chosen to save that way, that they will ultimately pay this tax. So it throws up all sorts of anomalies. And then you've got the issue of past politicians, judges, public servants who receive, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, much of it tax-free, in pensions. And if you or I were to try and replicate that income stream, we would need many millions of dollars, way beyond $3 million in superannuation. Is it fair that that person can continue on as they have and not pay any additional tax, whereas a person who has had to save the traditional route will have to pay the tax?
Just another way to emphasise you're safer working for the government than going out there and being an entrepreneur, working for yourself and saving for yourself. One last thing, the measures today won't kick in until after the election. They've been grandfathered, but should other, and it applies only to people with balances of 3 million, should other people with super accounts worry?
Of course they should, because one thing that Jim Chalmers has said today is that he does not want to see this indexed. So in other words, he doesn't want to see the $3 million rise each year, and yet your typical superannuation balance will rise by 7% or more per year. So that raises the question as to whether there is bracket creep here. Because if you let that go for, say, for example, I don't know, 10 years or something like that, 7 years, 10 years, it'll double the amount of money that people have got in superannuation. So a person today with $1.5 million in super, if they don't index it, ultimately will get caught with this extra tax. And so this is almost a way of bracket creep in a different form. And that is something that people have got to be conscious of and have got to push the government on as it makes these moves.
Ross Greenwood, it's like the explanation a bank robber gave. Why did you rob the bank? Well, because that's where the money is. Why did the government rob the super funds? Because that's where all the money is. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
Quite okay.